Long ago, in the middle of a cold winter, a beautiful queen sat by her palace window sewing. Outside, the ground was covered with white snow. While sewing, she accidentally pricked her finger with a needle. A few bright red drops of blood fell onto the snow-covered windowsill. The queen looked at the red blood on the white snow and smiled. "How beautiful," she whispered. Then she made a wish. "I wish I had a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony wood." Soon, her wish came true. A baby girl was born, and she looked exactly as the queen had imagined. Her skin was white as snow, her lips were red like roses, and her hair was black as the night sky. The king and queen named her Snow White. But sadly, not long after Snow White was born, the queen became very ill and passed away. The whole kingdom mourned her loss. A year later, years passed, and Snow White grew into a kind, gentle, and beautiful young girl. Everyone in the kingdom loved her. Wherever she went, people admired her beauty and kindness. By the time Snow White was 7 years old, her beauty was known throughout the land. One morning, the queen stood before her magical mirror, as usual, and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" But this time, the mirror gave a different answer. "My queen, you are beautiful, it is true, but Snow White is far fairer than you." The queen's face turned red with anger. "What?" she shouted. "Snow White is more beautiful than me?" Jealousy filled her heart. From that day on, every time she saw Snow White, her hatred grew stronger. She thought, "As long as Snow White is alive, I will never." The next day, the huntsman took Snow White into the forest, pretending they were going for a walk. The forest was dark and thick. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, and silence filled the air. When they reached a lonely spot deep in the woods, the huntsman stopped. Slowly, he drew his knife. Snow White looked at him in surprise. Then she realized something was wrong. She began to tremble with fear. "Mr. Huntsman?" she asked softly. "What is happening?" Tears filled the huntsman's eyes. Snow White fell to her knees and pleaded, "Please don't hurt me. Let me go. I promise I will never return to the palace. I will live in the forest forever." The huntsman looked at the frightened, innocent girl and could not bring himself to harm her. He lowered his knife and said, "Run, Snow White. Go as far away as you can and never come back." With tears in her eyes, Snow White thanked him and ran deep into the forest. To trick the queen, the huntsman killed a wild boar and took its heart back to the palace. The queen believed Snow White was dead. Meanwhile, Snow White wandered alone through the forest. She was scared and exhausted. Every rustling leaf frightened her. Every sound made her think someone was following her. She kept running and crying until evening came. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, she suddenly noticed. The next day, the huntsman took Snow White into the forest, pretending they were going for a walk. The forest was dark and thick. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, and silence filled the air. When they reached a lonely spot deep in the woods, the huntsman stopped. Slowly, he drew his knife. Snow White looked at him in surprise. Then she realized something was wrong. She began to tremble with fear. "Mr. Huntsman?" she asked softly. "What is happening?" Tears filled the huntsman's eyes. Snow White fell to her knees and pleaded, "Please don't hurt me. Let me go. I promise I will never return to the palace. I will live in the forest forever." The huntsman looked at the frightened, innocent girl and could not bring himself to harm her. He lowered his knife and said, "Run, Snow White. Go as far away as you can and never come back." With tears in her eyes, Snow White thanked him and ran deep into the forest. To trick the queen, the huntsman killed a wild boar and took its heart back to the palace. The queen believed Snow White was dead. Meanwhile, Snow White wandered alone through the forest. She was scared and exhausted. Every rustling leaf frightened her. Every sound made her think someone was following her. She kept running and crying until evening came. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, she suddenly noticed a small, strange cottage hidden among the woods. Snow White slowly walked toward it. She had no idea who lived there, but she was so tired that she had no choice but to stop and rest. After running through the dark forest for hours, Snow White finally noticed a small cottage hidden among the trees. As she walked closer, she saw that the cottage was neat and beautiful. Colorful flowers bloomed around the door, and tiny curtains hung in the windows. Snow White knocked on the door, but no one answered. Carefully, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. To her surprise, everything in the house was very small. There were 7 little plates on the table, along with 7 cups, 7 spoons, and 7 chairs. Snow White was extremely hungry. She took a tiny bite from each plate so she would not eat too much of anyone's food. Then she took a small sip of water from each cup. After eating, she felt very tired. Upstairs, she discovered 7 small beds. She tried them one by one, but none seemed comfortable enough. Finally, the 7th bed felt just right. She lay down and quickly fell into a deep sleep. That evening, the 7 dwarfs who worked in the mountains returned home. The moment they entered, they noticed something was different. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," said the first dwarf. "Someone drank from my cup," said the second. "And someone ate from my plate," cried the third. Curious and surprised, they went upstairs. There, sleeping peacefully in the 7th bed, was a beautiful young girl. The dwarfs stared in amazement. "She is so beautiful," whispered one dwarf. "I have never seen such a sweet child," said another. Since Snow White looked so peaceful, they decided not to wake her. The next morning, Snow White opened her eyes and saw 7 dwarfs standing around her bed. At first, she was frightened, but the dwarfs smiled kindly and asked, "Who are you, and how did you get here?" Snow White told them everything. She explained how her stepmother wanted her dead and how she had escaped into the forest. The dwarfs felt sorry for her. "You may stay here with us," said the oldest dwarf. "Yes," another added. "If you help take care of the house, cook meals, and keep things tidy, this home can be yours too." Tears of happiness filled. The days passed peacefully. Every morning, the dwarfs went to work in the mines, while Snow White cleaned the cottage, cooked delicious meals, and cared for the garden. However, the dwarfs always reminded her of one important rule. Snow White, never open the door to strangers. If your stepmother discovers that you are alive, she will surely try to harm you. Snow White always promised to be careful. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the queen believed that Snow White was dead. One day, she stood before her magical mirror as usual and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" But this time, the answer shocked her. "My queen, you are beautiful indeed, but Snow White, who lives beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs, is far fairer than you." The queen's face turned red with rage. "So she is still alive!" she screamed. This cannot be! Filled with anger and jealousy, she decided that this time she would get rid of Snow White herself. Using magic, the queen transformed herself into an old woman. Her face became wrinkled, her back bent with age, and even her voice changed. Then she took some beautiful silk laces and set off toward the dwarf's cottage. When she arrived, she knocked on the door and called out, "Beautiful silk laces for sale." Snow White peeked through the window. The old woman looked harmless and kind. Snow White thought, perhaps it wouldn't hurt to speak with her. But that was exactly the mistake the queen had been waiting for. Snow White opened the door. The queen, disguised as an old woman, smiled warmly and said, "My dear, look at these beautiful silk laces." Snow White admired them. "They are lovely," she said. "Come," said the old woman, "let me show you how to wear them." Snow White was innocent and suspected nothing. The queen wrapped the silk lace around Snow White's waist and slowly pulled it tighter and tighter. Soon, Snow White could hardly breathe. A moment later, she collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. The queen laughed with delight. "At last, you are finished!" Then she hurried away. That evening, the 7 dwarfs returned home. They found Snow White lying motionless on the floor and rushed to help her. After searching carefully, they discovered the tight silk lace around her waist. Quickly, they cut it loose. As soon as the lace was removed, Snow White began breathing again and slowly woke up. The dwarfs were relieved. "This must have been your stepmother," they warned. "Never open the door to strangers again." Snow White promised to be more careful. Back at the palace, the queen asked her magic mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "Snow White is still the fairest." The queen was furious. This time, she prepared a poisoned comb and disguised herself as an old woman once again. When she arrived at the cottage, she called out, "Beautiful combs for sale!" At first, Snow White refused to open the door. But the old woman convinced her to at least look at the comb. The comb was so beautiful that Snow White could not resist. The moment the old woman placed it in her hair, the poison took effect. Snow White fell to the ground, unconscious. The queen laughed and left. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White unconscious once again. They searched the cottage and eventually discovered the poisoned comb hidden in her hair. As soon as they removed it, Snow White opened her eyes. The dwarves were worried and upset. "Snow White, you ignored our warning again!" Snow White apologized sincerely. Meanwhile, the queen returned to her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror answered, "Snow White is still alive and still the fairest." The queen's anger reached its limit. She decided to use a plan that could not fail. She prepared a beautiful apple. One half was poisoned, while the other half was perfectly safe. Disguised as a farmer's wife, she traveled once more to the dwarf's cottage. The woman called out, "Fresh, sweet apples, the finest apples from the orchard." "I cannot open the door," Snow White replied. "That's all right," said the woman. "I'll give you one for free." Snow White still hesitated. To gain her trust, the woman cut the apple in half and ate the safe side herself. Seeing this, Snow White felt reassured. She took the other half and ate a bite. Instantly, the powerful poison took effect. Snow White fell to the ground. That evening, the dwarfs returned and found her lying still and silent. They tried everything they could, but they could not wake her. Heartbroken, they wept. For 3 days they stayed beside her. When she still did not awaken, they placed her in a beautiful glass coffin and set it on a mountain peak, where they watched over her day and night. Some time later, a handsome prince passed through the forest. He saw Snow White resting in the glass coffin. She looked as beautiful as ever. The prince was deeply moved and asked the dwarfs if he could take the coffin with him and honor her forever. The dwarfs eventually agreed. As the prince's servants carried the coffin away, one of them stumbled over a tree root. The coffin jolted suddenly. The piece of poisoned apple lodged in Snow White's throat was shaken loose and fell out. Moments later, her eyelids fluttered open. "Where am I?" she asked softly. The prince smiled with joy. "You are safe," he said. Then he asked, "Snow White, will you come with me to my kingdom, and will you become my queen?" Snow White smiled and agreed. Soon, a grand wedding was prepared. Guests came from far and wide, including the wicked queen. Before leaving, the queen asked her mirror one final time, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You are beautiful, my queen, but the new queen is far fairer than you." At the wedding, the queen discovered that Snow White was alive, happy, and more beautiful than ever. Filled with shock and fear, she realized that her jealousy and cruelty had brought about her own downfall. After that, Snow White and the prince ruled their kingdom with kindness, fairness, and love. Snow White never forgot the 7 dwarfs who had helped her in her darkest time. She often visited them and treated them as honored friends. And so, goodness, friendship, and love triumphed in the end. Snow White, the prince, and the 7 dwarfs lived happily ever after. Sparkle Castle Storybook.